Hi, everybody. My name is Stéphane Bilodeau, and on behalf of the Zero COVID Canada team, but also of endcoronavirus.org, I welcome every one of you to this open Zoom meeting. It's the end of day on Good Friday 2021, and you're all here for good reasons. We are in a critical time in Canada and abroad, indeed. So just before starting, just looking at some quick housekeeping things. First, the microphone will be off for everybody but for the presenters. Indeed, you'll be able to ask questions and interact with the chat. So the chat will be open later on. Please consider that all this will not be essentially medical advices, but more information on potential strategies and on the science. So today you'll hear on Zero COVID, as I said, from many great speakers. Dr. Dosia Gasparovic first, and then you'll hear from Connor Ruzicki, PhD candidate. Dr. Maria Infante will talk after that. And that will be with the closing remarks done by Dr. Yanir Pariam, founder of End Coronavirus, at the end of the presentations. But first, let me give you some context. Earlier this year, some were thinking this pandemic was almost behind us. After all, it had toured through the long-term care facilities in Canada, as you see, elders and vulnerable populations across the country, but a few provinces were affected a lot. But vaccine would come and we would be out of the wood kind of instantaneously. In the last few weeks, we've all seen to the contrary that COVID was still leaving a trail of death and shock in its wake. So touching even younger population and more than ever. So in that context, what is Zero COVID Canada? So Zero COVID Canada is a group of Canadians from different backgrounds, different professions, society, that believe that it is possible to eliminate COVID-19 from every province, not only just a few, and in the whole Canada. So we collaborate with other groups, indeed in coronavirus, but also COVID is airborne, as you'll be hearing later on, to achieve that. Today, we want to talk about the solution to this controlled pandemic. In many countries in the world, it's already used, it's already giving great results. So it's the zero COVID. Some are calling them COVID zero, others are referring to it by the elimination strategy. That will be the main topic of our discussions today. So why Canada should be adopting a zero COVID strategy? So sorry for the slides mixed. So evidence are suggesting more and more that countries that are pursuing the zero COVID are performing much better than those trying to suppress the virus. So the mitigation strategy has not given good results, while the zero COVID has given concrete, fast, and lasting results. So aiming to zero COVID is producing much more positive results, not only on the healthcare side, but also on the economic side. So I will just give you a quick set of 5 good reasons to go further with zero COVID, and I'll let all our great speakers go further into all this. But definitely the first one is a zero COVID strategy would save lives. Definitely with an elimination of the virus, the first outcome you'll see is a reduction of the deaths and the cases indeed. But first, deaths will be reduced definitely, the number of deaths. Second thing, elimination of community transmission through zero COVID strategy will spare a big portion of the population from long COVID and all the lasting effects on people, on the healthcare system, on the economy, and all the things around that. So long COVID, sparing long COVID consequences is a second great consequence of using this good strategy. Elimination is also, or zero COVID, a pro-equity strategy. So the elimination of community transmission reduce the risk on vulnerable population. So based on ethnicity, on income, on long-term illness, vulnerables are always the first to be hit and affected by sickness and disease, but especially in this COVID pandemic, we've seen that, and we continue to see that more and more, even with the variants coming. Fourth item I would mention is the elimination is achievable in a variety of settings. Many countries have done it. Many countries, which some were islands, other were land countries, other were smaller countries, bigger countries. So a variation of possibilities has always come to good consequence. So elimination strategy, zero COVID we're able to apply it in Canada for sure. Not only we're able to apply it, some province, and we can refer to the Atlantic bubble as I've already done it and maintain it for months, while the other provinces, as you know, are definitely not on the same place on this point. Last thing is it is a strategy which is complementary to vaccination. So rather waiting for vaccination to give its final results, we can accelerate all this and minimize the consequence on the population. So that's a reason to do it. I'll let the great presenters give you more reasons and more ways. I explain it much better than me. So we'll start with Dr. Dosia Gasparovic, which will be talking about many more good reasons and why we should use zero COVID strategy in Canada. Go ahead, Dosia. Dosia, I think you're on mute still.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Good afternoon. I'm Dosia Gasparovic. I'm a developmental biologist, and I've been observing the spread of the dynamics of the spread of the virus since basically last.
You muted yourself, Dosia.
Oh, now I'm unmuted?
No, now you're back on.
Okay, I don't know. Okay, so COVID spread is like, it's a biological phenomenon. It's a virus jumping from person to person. And it spreads, it's very similar in the dynamics to melanoma cancer, mice infestation, or wildfire. So the things that have to be eliminated totally in order to not rebound and spread again. So if, for example, if you have 5 melanoma moles on your hand, you remove all of them. You don't leave one melanoma mole and just observe it because you don't want to have a spreading cancer. Similar is with mice infestation in a kitchen. You eliminate all the mice, you don't leave 2 couples to reproduce and make your kitchen full of mice again. So here is a good illustration of what happened, like when this dynamics was ignored. Like in Alberta, we had last spring, we almost eliminated the local transmissions of the virus. We've been at very like just 10, 15 daily cases. But we reopened and we let the virus spread again and grow again. And it grew over the whole summer, doubling every 60 days, and then burst into the explosion in the fall. But what is important that actually if we would keep the lockdown for around a month longer, it is very possible that we could eliminate it around June 26, that we could reach zero then. Similar example of this phenomena is what happened during the second wave, almost all over the world, that people implemented lockdowns, but short. So they didn't finish the job with the lockdown. They didn't drive the cases down to zero, but then reopened and almost instantaneously cases started to grow again. Contrary to this, the countries that aim for zero COVID, like Australia and especially Victoria in Australia, that had large outbreak, but they decided to eliminate it. In 10 weeks, basically in 10 weeks from their peak, they reached zero, and then they could reopen, and they basically reopened for good, and now people have relatively normal life there. In Australia, in New Zealand, there are like, you can see probably online the pictures of people joining a big crowded festival without masks because they don't have the virus spreading there. Other countries that eliminate, like there's many countries, like around now 40 or 50 that eliminate, or maybe 24 that eliminated the virus. There's New Zealand, Australia, Atlantic Canada, Vietnam, Taiwan, and others. And others. We have our own Canadian example of zero COVID regions. There's all Atlantic Canada provinces and the territories. And here's a graph of daily cases in Nova Scotia. So we see the first wave, and then they drove the cases to zero. So they had no community transmission and many months of relative normalcy without COVID. Then in winter, they had some outbreaks, but they are all small. They are all smaller than the first wave. While now in Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta, the second wave was much, much larger than our first wave. It was totally dwarfed the first wave. And what is also important in Atlantic Canada, that some of those new outbreaks were the outbreaks including variants, and they managed to stamp it out. Like nobody, like even Denmark didn't manage to stamp out the variant. Everybody who doesn't have zero COVID policy has problem with the variants, while Atlantic Canada effectively stamped it out. And here, this graph really shows like how striking the difference is between those two policies. So it shows the active cases per 100,000 people. Here we have the COVID permissive provinces with high COVID numbers, while zero COVID provinces and territories have almost no cases. And here, now the variants may change the game, like make it tougher, because they spread much faster, especially the UK variant and probably also the Brazilian one. And what we see, like with the old variant, that's the dashed blue line, with current restrictions, it could still just slowly grow, while the new variant, the red dashed line, is speeding up and it's driving the surge. Like today in Alberta, so that's the graph for Alberta. Today, Alberta had 1,100 new cases, which is super lot. So the variant is faster. It will be more difficult to stamp. It will be more difficult to bend this curve. So we will need at least so the restrictions that we had in January won't stop the variant. We need something stronger. We need restrictions, at least like in Australia or New Zealand, but it is possible. So if we implement today the strong lockdown and aim for zero COVID, then basically we can drive the B117, so-called UK variant, to zero cases in 10 weeks. You can see here that with the old variant, it would just take 7 weeks because it's slower. With the new, it's more challenging, but it is still doable. So and basically in 10 weeks, it's like June 10th. So by June 10th, we could be like New Zealand or Atlantic Canada or Australia, and we could have basically COVID-free life. And then still June 10, not everybody will be vaccinated. So then the vaccines will still help us, but we won't heavily rely on them just to survive. So how to achieve zero COVID? The most important thing is the decision and explicit goal of COVID elimination, very clearly communicated to the population that we know that we are aiming for stopping all community transmission and having our normalcy back as soon as possible. It requires travel control, so mandatory quarantine for international and interprovincial travelers. Also, what would help very much would be dividing provinces into even smaller land chunks. So for example, in Alberta, limiting travel between Edmonton and Calgary so we don't keep reinfecting each other. And then strong financially supported lockdown is very important. So basically it's shutting down all non-essential activities like in-person schools or places of worship or all the stores that don't have to be opened. But that requires a very, very strong financial support for those businesses and for individuals and for parents uh, for being able to stay at home and take care of their children. Because like without support, it will be very difficult to do. We need to prevent airborne COVID transmission with providing everybody with as good respirators as possibly, preferably N95 respirators, improving ventilation and air filtration in buildings, and using aggressive testing, tracing, and isolating approach. Thank you very much. Now I pass it to Connor.
Right. Thanks, Dosia. So my name is Connor Zicki. I'm a PhD candidate and Killam Scholar at the University of Alberta. For the past year or so, I've been quite interested in the COVID-19 problem, mostly due to its relation to bioaerosols. Most of my traditional research has been in pharmaceutical aerosols, but the bioaerosol problem is quite an interesting one. So let's get into it. Next slide. Thanks. So before we dig into airborne transmission specifically, it's useful to review a few things that we've observed with COVID-19. And of particular importance are the super spreading events that we've all seen covered in the news. And with these super spreading events where one person can tend to infect several others who all go on to transmit to even more people down the line, they aren't really linked to one or two particular activities or events. We've seen these outbreaks occur in a huge range of different events and activities, everything from cruise ships to choirs to weddings to exercise classes, et cetera, and in a lot of different workplaces as well. And if we dig into these different super spreading events and we look at what common features are between them, one of the most important ones is they're essentially always occurring indoors. Other factors that are playing a role here is there's limited ventilation, there's inconsistent mask use, and there are long durations of exposure. So that is one very important thing with COVID-19 is that we get a lot of these super spreading events occurring indoors. Another thing is that we know that COVID-19 is a very over-dispersed disease, which means that relatively few people are responsible for the majority of transmission. And we're talking like 10 to 20% of people being responsible for about 80% of all transmissions. And this tells us that it's very, very important to both control and to avoid these sorts of super spreading events that are contributing really to the spread and the uncontrolled spread of this disease. One other thing we've noticed is that pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic transmission is considerable, with up to something like 50% of total transmissions originating from a pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic carrier. And considering that pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic people, they aren't coughing or sneezing, we have to sort of question how they could possibly be spreading this disease to others. Next slide. So that brings us to bioaerosols. And what are bioaerosols? Well, they're basically tiny particles that are created in our airways. And they tend to be made up of water, salt, protein, other material that's in the airway surface liquid or saliva. And if someone happens to be infected with COVID-19, these bioaerosols that they're producing can contain individual SARS-CoV-2 viruses. And it turns out that we're actually creating and emitting these bioaerosols during any number of actions, essentially constantly. We tend to emit relatively few when we're just breathing, but we emit far more when we talk, when we exercise, cough, or sneeze, or all those different sorts of things. And there have been some really good studies that have demonstrated this recently, like the one that's summarized on this slide, which shows that patients are actually producing a large amount of aerosol with or without the use of medical procedures. And one thing to note is that because bioaerosols are so tiny, we need fairly sophisticated equipment to actually measure them accurately, like is shown in the setup on the right. But bioaerosols by themselves are not necessarily dangerous, and we need to figure out if we actually have to worry about them. So let's briefly talk about how these aerosols behave. Basically, physics tells us that we know that these aerosols are going to spread out from the source. They are most concentrated at the spot of emission, and they dilute and they spread out with distance. So because of how they behave, we need to keep in mind that inhalation exposure to these aerosols is important both in close proximity and across longer distances. And you can sort of see the motion of bioaerosols in a series of images at the bottom of the slide, where you can really see the evolution of a sneeze and how aerosols spread out and move from the source. But another thing that science tells us is that we always have some sort of convective and buoyant motion that occurs with breathing, with talking, with coughing. And this means that bioaerosols are always going to tend to spread out in a room, with or without the presence of air currents. So as a result, the idea of there being a safe distance between people indoors really loses sort of any substantial meaning. There's no real thing as a safe distance when you're sharing a space with somebody else if we're talking about these bioaerosols and exposure to them. Next slide. So probably the most important question that we have to answer is whether or not these bioaerosols that contain SARS-CoV-2 virus are actually infectious. And we've had several studies that have demonstrated viral RNA in air samples, but this demonstration of viral RNA is not indicative of infectivity necessarily, because this RNA can arise from dead or inactivated virus. It also turns out that culturing live virus from the air is notoriously difficult, mostly because of how harsh the equipment is on actual viruses. And it's actually so difficult that I'm not aware of a study that has managed to culture live measles virus, despite measles being a very well accepted airborne disease. It's essentially the gold standard people use when they're talking about something being airborne or not. But the rather amazing thing with SARS-CoV-2 is that there is, at least at this point, one fully peer-reviewed study that has actually successfully cultured live SARS-CoV-2 from air samples. This was done by a group led Nikki et al., who were able to culture live SARS-CoV-2 from the air in a patient in a hospital room with COVID-19 patients. This is actually a very, very amazing finding that really lends strong support to the idea that bioaerosols can act as a vector to transmission. So if we couple that together with other evidence from the basic sciences, our sort of appreciation for super spreading events, pre-symptomatic transmission, and things like the vastly increased risk of transmission indoors, we can pretty confidently say at this point that bioaerosols are playing a very important role with the transmission of SARS-CoV-2. All right, next slide, please. So knowing that bioaerosols are important, what are some of the things that we can start to do to address them? Well, for one, masks are extremely useful here because they help to both reduce the amount and the spread of aerosols from the source, and the source here being an infected person. And they also provide protection to the wearer, so they can also act as a little bit like PPE for whoever is exposed to this infected person. There are three very important factors that tell us how to optimize protection we get from masks, and these are filtration, they are breathability, and they are fit. So to maximize the amount of protection we get from masks, we need to be using materials that have a high filtration efficiency, but that also give us a fit that makes sure that we're breathing through the mask rather than around the edges of it. A really great infographic here on the slide on the right shows sort of a, it summarizes a lot of this important information. And I'll note that a large number of Canadian suppliers have actually stepped up to begin manufacturing and distributing better masks and respirators for Canadians. So if you're interested in finding one, you can go through the link at the bottom of this slide that was compiled by an advocacy group known as Masks for Canada. Next slide, please. What about mitigating inhalation exposure in general? Well, this is a really good infographic here that provides a quick summary of what we can consider safe activities or good measures to implement, which are in green, and what are things that we need to avoid as much as possible, which are things in red. And at this point, we really need to be avoiding indoor gatherings as much as possible. But if we do need to go indoors, there are a number of things we can do to help reduce our exposure. These are things like well-fitting masks, things like maintaining physical distance, avoiding crowds, and reducing the time that you actually spend inside. These are all very helpful measures to reduce the chances that you're exposed indoors. And another tool to consider implementing is actually monitoring carbon dioxide levels, because that can give you an idea of how good the ventilation is in a particular space. The lower the amount of CO2, the better. And once you get below about something like 450 parts per million, you're basically at outdoor levels. And that indicates that you have fantastic ventilation and you're really reducing the potential buildup of bioaerosol that can occur over time. But of course, I think the most important thing is that if you can get outdoors and maintain distance, do that. Because if you're outdoors, if you're maintaining distance and you're avoiding crowds, that's probably about the safest way that you can interact with others at this point in time. Next slide. This is the last slide here. Basically, I'll just reiterate some of the various ways that we can mitigate transmission indoors. So there are many things we can do, like regular and consistent masking, upgrading to better masks, improving ventilation, incorporating HEPA-type air purifiers. These are all things that can significantly reduce the risk of transmission occurring indoors via inhalation of these bioaerosols. They're all very good things to be looking into at this point in time. At this point in time, it's also important to avoid any non-essential indoor gatherings as much as possible. This includes things like indoor dining, which is probably one of the worst things we can be doing at this point in time, given what we're seeing with community spread. We should also be moving as many outdoors and events and gatherings, be moving these things outdoors as much as possible. But if indoor gatherings are necessary, you want to be implementing multiple layers to mitigate transmission risks. And this is captured really, really well schematically by what's known as the Swiss cheese model, which is where you're basically adding in as many different protective layers as you can, so that the failure of one layer, like if your mask is not fitting properly, it does not necessarily mean you're going to be exposed if somebody in the same space as you actually has COVID-19. So I think given what we're seeing with the increased transmissibility of the variants of concern and the increased community transmission we've been observing in the past few weeks in Canada, we need to seriously be pushing to incorporate as many of these layers as possible to help limit transmission moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Connor, for this presentation on the airborne nature. Thank you, Dosia, as well. Earlier, I was stuck with my unmute button, so I have not time to tell you. Thank you for your presentation and on the how and why we should use the zero COVID strategy. Now we will have Dr. Maria Infante that will talk about the precautionary principle. So go ahead, Maria.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Maria Infante. I did my PhD research at UBC, where I looked at how uncertainty affected the valuation of ecosystem services, or the benefits that we get from nature. And today I'd like to propose that the precautionary principle is important not just for natural ecosystems, to conserve the benefits from nature, which in my research area, which is ecological economics, we don't only look at economic or market values, but we look at the non-market benefits from nature, including the meaning of these benefits to people, spiritual values even, and not just the exchange or even use value, bequest value of natural ecosystems. So today I'd like to talk about why the precautionary principle is so important in responding to a pandemic. So the precautionary principle is science-based, a decision analysis approach. It's to take action to reduce risk, even in the absence of scientific certainty, when facing a threat that's characterized by a great uncertainty. So we don't know everything about it. And there's a risk of a large magnitude and irreversible loss. So when you read that line about the precautionary principle, you can see that the pandemic fits this. There's a lot of scientific uncertainty. There's a lot we know about the virus, but if the response is not done correctly, it's not as if you can say, we'll only allow restaurants to be open until there's 300 people in hospital. You can't do that in a pandemic. And Gosha has gone over that. It's because of the pandemic dynamics, the exponential growth. It's not really something you can manage. And obviously, as we've seen in many countries around the world, and even here in Canada, the loss, when you look at fatality, right? Even the epidemiologists look at this, fatality is irreversible. So you want to do everything you can to prevent harm, the harm to health, people's livelihoods, as well as the irreversibility of death. Canada's SARS Commission, the final report, which was commissioned by Ontario, the Honorable Judge Archie Campbell in 2006, identified that the single most important lesson of SARS in Toronto was that reasonable efforts to reduce risk need not wait scientific proof. And if you, I would really recommend everyone, download this report. You can get it on the archive and read this report. It's quite evocative. And when you read it in the context of the pandemic, it's quite moving. So, for example, for the protection of healthcare workers, which we address in our call to action in our open letter, which is to provide healthcare workers and frontline workers and all the vulnerable with N95s, and in fact, to even provide the general public with an N95 free of charge, as they're doing in Germany. So Judge Campbell writes, there were two solitudes during SARS: infection control and worker safety. Infection control insisted that SARS was mostly spread by large droplets which do not travel far from an infectious person. Given that case, in their view, a surgical mask was sufficient to protect healthcare workers in most situations. Worker safety experts said workers at risk should have the higher level of protection of an N95. They said not enough is known about how SARS is spread to rule out airborne transmission by much smaller particles, and besides, hospitals are dynamic places where unforeseen events and accidents can always happen. The Canadian Federation of Nurses have in fact given a recommendation that's based on science, worker health and safety, and the precautionary principle to ask for the higher level protections that respiratory or airborne precautions would require versus contact or droplet. And in fact, they've cited, if you go to their website, they'll say that now that the Government of Canada, the Public Health Agency of Canada, has recognized that transmission of COVID can take place via airborne transmission, that it's time to provide, better fitted respirators for healthcare workers in Canada. So before I also wanted to say that from the SARS Commission, they said that the single most important lesson from SARS 2003 in Ontario was to identify the precautionary principle as the approach that was needed. They said that the importance of the precautionary principle, that reasonable efforts to reduce risk need not await scientific proof, was demonstrated over and over during SARS. And so the recommendations of the SARS Commission is that in any future infectious disease, the precautionary principle should guide the development, implementation, and monitoring of procedures, guidelines, processes, and systems for the early detection and treatment of possible cases. But not only with any future infectious disease, but actually the SARS Commission does have a specific recommendation for future pandemics that government and health systems should apply the precautionary principle. So next slide. Next slide, yeah. What I do in the next two slides is to give an analogy to a complex natural ecosystem. This is taken from the Georges Bank marine ecosystem. It was a threatened resource. And this slide shows, I understand that it's not completely analogous to a pandemic, but try to take the lessons, like when you're looking at a natural complex ecosystem marked by high uncertainty, and that if it's not managed correctly, then there's a possibility of a large magnitude irreversible loss. So the Georges Bank yellow-tailed flounder is considered a collapsed marine resource. And in fact, in certain parts of the I believe it's considered virtually extinct in the offshore of Nova Scotia. So the Georges Bank yellow-tailed flounder is a transboundary resource shared between the US and Canada. It's located in the northwest of Nova Scotia. And here in this graph, you see the landings or what was fished of the Georges Bank yellow-tailed flounder from 1935 to 2010. So you can see that there was significant biomass removed out of this resource uh, with a peak in 71. And you see the resource is slowly depleted, well, actually rapidly depleted, to where it's considered virtually extinct at the time of my study, which was 2012, 2013. In 1990, in the early 90s, they decided, because it was no longer economic to fish the Georges Bank yellowtail flounder. And in fact, in Canada, even if there was a quota, in some years, they didn't even go bother to fish it because it was not economically feasible. So they decided to close the large areas. And those familiar with the case of the Newfoundland cod will know that it's about the same period. You'll see the excessive quotas remained. And you see the dotted line is the scientific estimate of what biomass was in the ocean. But if you look at the actual landings, you can see that they believe there's this biomass out there that they can fish, but they can't actually find it, So they're not, the landings are way below what they've estimated. So there's obviously probably some error in the estimated biomass. Towards the end, you'll see that the quotas, they did, after the closure of large areas, they kept the quotas very low, but then they increased it again in 2004, believing that the biomass had returned. But by, as I said, the early 2011, 2012, they realized that there was nothing there. I mean, it was virtually extinct already. There was a ruling in the US, the Department of Commerce, that they still allowed 500 metric tons of bycatch. That means when they went out to fish other more plentiful fish in the Georges Bank marine ecosystem, they were allowed to keep the yellowtail flounder that just got caught in their nets. But the question was, should they just have closed down this fishery? Why were they still allowing? Why was there a bycatch quota of 500 metric tons when obviously this was a stressed resource? Next slide, please. So what I did was I simulated what happens if you have two different policies. One was what I called you fish only at a reference rate. And actually, I believe this was a very conservative fishing policy, but it allowed, the best would have been to just close the fisheries for a while and then allow the biomass to return. What you see is with this conservative policy, then the risk that the stock actually becomes extinct is reduced. In the other, a reference fishing policy that continues to fish at a certain supposedly safe level actually leads the stock to virtual extinction. So the stock remains collapsed. And if you look at the probability density functions of these two policies, you will see that there's that left tail, that large left tail, where you have this large potential for large magnitude loss. So in other words, if you look at the biomass, from 0 to, let's say it's 25 metric tons that remains, the probability density function is heavily skewed to the left, which means that it's most probably going to be 0. Next slide, please. So what I conclude from that is the collapse of complex systems, such as a natural ecosystem, such as the fishery or a valued resource in a marine ecosystem, and the loss of the benefits from nature, which could be great, highlights the importance of the precautionary principle. With COVID, marked by great uncertainty, it's highly contagious, RO grows exponentially. The pandemic math, which some of the analysts refer to, tell us it's not possible to manage this pandemic response. It's not possible to say, well, let's only have a little bit of virus, as Dosia has said. It will just continue to grow exponentially. You won't be able to control it, and then it becomes more difficult to hunt out and eliminate the virus. So with a pandemic like COVID, you can't aim to manage it, to find a threshold. You can only aim to eliminate the virus, to bring it to zero. Only a zero COVID strategy is rational from economic and the well-being of people, and ethical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. So yes, precautionary principle is the key, and to make it correctly, elimination is the only way to do it. And Canada is knowing it since 2006, so that's really an important thing. Uh, we're pleased for the concluding remarks, just before the Q&A I was talking about, to have Professor Yanir Bariam today. He's the founding president of the New England Complex System Institute, and also the founder of endcoronavirus.org. So welcome, Yanir, and I'll let you go with your remarks.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you all for having me. It's never too late to save lives. And now we are at a point where we really have all the information that we need to show that there are no trade-offs, as people have believed, between saving lives and economic well-being. That the real goal that we can have and can realize is the existence that we would like, the ability to share times with family and friends, and to have public occasions, sporting events, go to restaurants, and have other activities that we would really like. And we've seen that it's possible, and it's being realized in a day-to-day basis in countries that have taken the zero COVID path. And what we understand now is that it's the realization of that possibility, that it not only can be done, but it can be done in a short period of time. That by taking several weeks to strongly suppress the outbreak, to partition areas so that localities can eliminate the virus within their domain and protect themselves, that quite rapidly we can achieve that goal. And once we achieve that goal, we can protect it if there should become a new case. This was one of the key misunderstandings early in the pandemic, where people felt that there was no way to protect an area from reinfection, and therefore there was no elimination that was possible. We now know that it is, and even in, of course, Canada, where there are multiple provinces, the Atlantic bubble and the North Territories, it has been possible to protect areas for months from the growth of an uncontrolled outbreak. So now the question becomes, can the public and the government get together and execute on a plan to achieve elimination in the rest of Canada, or in particular provinces, particular areas of particular provinces, to demonstrate that it can be done and to pursue that path? Because, as I've said, the evidence is there that the benefits are near to hand. They're not far away. You've heard that they can be done in a month or two at most, if the actions that are taken are concerted, intentional, and are engaged in both by leaders and by the public. And that shared responsibility of the community and of the leaders is what we need in order to enable intentionality and the ability to choose what we want together. And so I wish you all success in achieving that. And I hope and look forward to your serving as an example for other places that also are able to, and maybe are hesitant because of uncertainty. But today we know that it can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yanir, for these insightful remarks. Just before going to the Q&A, I want to just give you one of the reasons why we are here today. So, taking action. So we are all in front of a a third wave, which is really severe in Canada and in many places in the world. And we, as Canadian, we want to make sure that the good decisions will be taken. So we already, just for you to know, have almost 500 signees for a Zero COVID Canada open letter, which is already released, and you can find it. You have the link on the page right now. I will read just the last sentence, the last paragraph, just for you to get the idea. It goes in the same direction as what Yanya just said and the other presenters as well. So Canada must aim for zero COVID today and protect all Canadians from further harm. It's unethical to permit the harm of some Canadians, often the most vulnerable, when zero COVID is possible and clearly beneficial for all of us. This strategy. We call on Canadian leaders to take strong action to protect the safety and well-being of all Canadians. So for these leaders to take action, we need each and every one of us here and your colleagues, your friend, to put your word, take action, and that's the first thing we recommend today. So the Zero COVID Canada open letter. Second thing you can do is the COVID is airborne petition to the WHO. So you also have the link on this page, and you have been given many reasons why it is important by Connor just a couple of minutes ago. On the 10th of April, another thing, there will be the Zero COVID Alliance Day. So it's coming from many organizations around the world, and coronavirus is definitely amongst them, but you have organizations from Germany to Australia and now to Canada, from Canada. So this is a key date to recall. Be sure you can participate with social media and many things. And coronavirus, a key reference that you should be definitely look at so many things at the community level up to the national and international level that is done by coronavirus. Protect yourself, protect others, your family, your close friends, your community. Get vaccinated. As we've said earlier, this is a complementary strategy, Zero COVID, to vaccination. It's not one or the other, it's the two, and more, as was said earlier. Join us, spread information. So now we'll start the Q&A. I'm just trying to get back on the chat. Maybe Josh, you can help me if I have need some follow-up on those things. Okay, so we have Carl, which is asking a question for Connor. What exactly is an aerosol generating medical procedure that institutions like the WHO talk about? So Connor, you can take this question.
Yeah, happy to. So the concept of an aerosol generating medical procedure is one that dates back a while now. And I think it has to do with a lot of experience during the first SARS pandemic, where healthcare workers performing certain medical procedures seem to be having a higher risk of becoming infected. And that the idea there, something that was never really investigated probably as well as it should have been, was that there was a thought that the procedures that they were undertaking were creating more aerosol than would have been created by the patient normally, thereby exposing the person who is in close contact to that patient who's undertaking that aerosol generating medical procedure, exposing them to more things than they would be otherwise. But I think what a lot of more recent research has shown in the past, the past few months especially, is that concept of it being the medical procedure that's generating aerosols is not correct. The patients are actually creating aerosols all the time. And a cough is producing a lot more aerosol than a regular intubation is. So I've seen a lot of calls from different people that we need to revisit this framework of an aerosol generating medical procedure, perhaps even discard it entirely. Because I do think when you're working with a patient, we need to realize that they are producing this aerosol all the time. You don't have to be doing an aerosol generating procedure on them for them to be producing the aerosol. So there's a risk of exposure for healthcare workers who are near these patients, regardless of the presence of medical procedures or not. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thanks very much, Connor. And you might know that just last week, there was a ruling for healthcare worker in long-term care and in hospitals in Quebec. A judge ruling was requiring N95 for healthcare workers. Absolutely. So that's a new thing that changed some guidelines there, just for you to know. That's a key question. Yanir, we have a question for you. It's from Josh Vanny. You've emphasized the importance of small scale and local action, Green Zone Strategy Canada, for example, in provinces and territory with population below 1 million. Have managed the pandemic well, while the others have not. Do you believe the size of a jurisdiction is a causal factor?
So first of all, we do have jurisdictions and places that have very high populations that have been successful, right? Vietnam and of course China. But one of the things that we've seen is that as leadership becomes further removed from the population, it tends not to have either perhaps the confidence or the knowledge of the support by the population. So for example, in Australia, the federal government, the central government, was not so in favor of elimination, whereas it was the state governments that took upon themselves to achieve elimination. So what we see is that as the leadership of larger areas kind of becomes less directly linked to the public, to the people, they may be supporting the people less well, or they may just not feel that they know how to lead the people in a direct action as we are involved in. So that's one part of it. At the same time, the other part of it is just the transmission process. The smaller the area, the faster you can get to elimination. And so if you have a small area, then you can do it fast. The other way is to divide it up. And what we saw, of course, in Australia is that twice or multiple times, cities were divided in parts, right? Melbourne was divided into two parts. So was Sydney was divided into neighborhoods that had the disease and that didn't. But the trick is to realize that you do the division after you know where the disease is. And this is one of the mistakes that's done in other places. First, you suppress it and you evaluate where you have it. And then you open up the areas that are without the disease. If you try to restrict the areas that you think have the disease before you know everywhere that has it, then you end up discovering afterwards that there were a bunch of areas where it is, where you didn't stop it. So again, the trick is to have subdivided areas, to open up the areas that are without the disease and protect them from reintroduction, and then to focus attention on the areas that still have it and achieve elimination throughout.
Thanks very much for your answer. So we have a couple of items which are more technical. I will just take them quickly. So are the slides used by the speaker available? So this very meeting will be public. So we'll try to make the slides as much as possible public as well. So that will be in the coming days. I don't want to put pressure on our IT team, but that should be coming soon. There is a reference from Lauren Craig on postcard or fax campaign targeting MPs as a good idea in the near future. So do we have someone that wants to take this question specifically? If not, I can answer quickly. I think all action to put pressure on the authorities to act according to the precautionary principle, as was referred to by Maria, or for all the reasons we've heard on the elimination strategy from Yanir, Dosia, and also from Connor. So all these reasons are good to put pressure on your elected officials. The best way to do it, there are many ways, I can't say, but definitely that's a potential approach. So we have another question on why do you recommend that schools move to online learning during a shutdown period? Why can they stay open if everything else is closed? I think there are many reasons, but I don't know if one of our speakers want to open on that. So
I can take it.
Yes, go ahead, Dosia.
So the goal with zero COVID is to finish the pandemic, to end all chains of community transmission as fast as possible. So we don't have unnecessary transmission, and we can in a couple of weeks reduce it to zero. So school doesn't help. Open school doesn't slow the things down. Closed school, yes. And as much as children need school, but they can survive without 6 weeks of school. And also, there was this myth that children don't spread the virus, that they don't get infected, and that they cannot get sick. Now we know that they spread the virus, they do get infected, they can get very sick. So it's really not safe to keep kids at school when there is pandemic raging.
And let me also add
Mhm.
that people think that it's just the transmission in the school that is affected. But the point is that whenever you have transmission in the school, then you also have transmission within the families. So you're connecting families through the schools. And so there's a lot more transmission that happens as a result of schools being open than just the transmission in the schools. And that's important in thinking about what the effect of closing schools is about.
Absolutely. So two good reasons. And by the way, Yanir, I have another question for you from David. How is it possible to limit mobility between these small zones you were referring to earlier? That was referring to? Would there have to be road barriers or else? So, what are your suggestions?
Yeah. So the first and most important thing is the clear communication with people. There are many countries that actually have mobility restrictions. Portugal, for example, has done very well in suppressing its recent outbreak, and they have restrictions of travel between municipalities. And that's had a tremendous effect. In Ireland, they had restrictions between county travel. And so the process of doing that first starts with just telling people that the travel is restricted, because the vast majority of people will follow instructions. And then if there is need for additional restrictions, the main thing is to provide permits for people, permits that are used for determining the essential travel that can go across the boundaries. So it's not really about sealing borders, it's about restricting travel to the essential travel. And there's always types of travel that is needed, like shipping, trucks and so on, and also essential workers that have to go across boundaries. And so all of that can be done. Again, it was done in multiple countries, including Australia. And there are special cases where you have border bubbles and so on that can be addressed. So all of this, if people, understand that the goal, as Dosia said, is to reduce the cases as rapidly as possible, because the entire objective is not to be doing this. It's to be doing the normal activities that you can achieve after a few weeks of stopping transmission, and shortening the time as much as possible is the key thing. So it's not about a specific policy per se, but it's about understanding that by doing the most possible to prevent transmission, we can achieve it. And that can be done by limiting travel, first of all, by informing people about the goal, second of all, by giving permits, and third of all, by having whatever extent of fines or enforcement is needed in order to refine the process and make sure we get there as quickly as possible.
Great way to address that. Thanks very much. We'll take a last question since we're already at the hour, and it's coming from.
I think what we could do, Stefan, is let's answer the final ones we have here. David's follow up, Michelle's question, and the new one that Jan just threw into the chat, and then that'll be it. So we're drawing the line here, and we'll answer these last three and call it a day. And if any of the guests have to go, that should be fine too. Good
idea, Josh. I follow your advice. So it's another question for Yanir, by the way. It's who are the mid and long-term risks of or benefits of either strategies? Is there any way to assess this yet?
Well, the first statement is that the mitigation strategy just failed completely, right? It was clear that it has the original objective of this mitigation was to somehow balance the effects of health and deaths against economic activity. And from the analysis that has been done and the obvious experience in the world, that has not been the case. And again, part of the reason for that idea was that elimination was not possible. And we've seen that elimination is possible. So the basic assumptions that went into that mitigation strategy have not been correct, were not correct, and the bad consequences continue. Now we again have risk in long-term consequences now with the balancing of the use of vaccines and the presence of variants, with the variants undermining the using of the usual suppression strategies, mitigation strategies, requiring them to be much stronger or leading to much higher health and economic costs, both actually. And then the big risk into the future is variants that evade the vaccines. And again, with a precautionary principle, the risk that we would end up with a new, more rapidly spreading, more lethal and vaccine evading variant that will lead us back into this terrible pandemic situation, despite the vaccine, is a tremendous risk to be taken. And the alternative of the zero COVID strategy has been demonstrated to have very low risk. There is, of course, the challenge of getting to zero itself, but what we know is that it can be achieved. It really requires intentionality. And the fact that it's been achieved in many countries that have many different qualities, including major parts of Canada, demonstrates that it should be possible. And the only thing that one might risk is that it takes a little bit longer than one might hope. But even that, one can refine the process. So the trick is, after you start to implement, you continue to ask, how can I do this better? How can I shorten the time? And the answer is, one can accelerate it now using mass testing, using localized application of vaccines called ring vaccination, using other tools that we have today that are in fact able to accelerate it faster than the decline in Australia or than in China or in other places, because we know how to do these things now and we didn't know how to do things at the time.
Thanks very much. And by the way, talking about vaccination, one of your last items, Michelle's question is referring to the fact that when so many policymakers are using vaccination as a golden ticket, how do you effectively communicate the importance of COVID-0 when the narrative is being focused around just hold on a little bit longer? So it's just a bit further on the point you just started, Yanir. And if others want to add something just after you, would be really great.
Again, there's no benefit from holding on instead of going to zero. All the benefits are from going to zero. This continues to be this false narrative that there is some balance that we're trying to achieve instead of the fact that we can achieve a goal that we want to achieve.
Yes, and I feel very passionately about aiming for zero, and we put this presentation together over the last week. The team at Zero COVID Canada, and we're aware that today is Good Friday, and we think this everything was done in just a few days because we are in the third wave. The variants are there. The uncertainty has increased. We can't wait another day. Canada has to act now. And I'd also like to acknowledge, Joshua had mentioned that John Lotwell is attending the Zoom presentation. So as part also of the day of action for the Zero COVID Alliance next week, what we're doing is trying to contact people in other countries. And so we're in touch with Zero COVID Canada, Zero COVID also in the US and Spain. And so when our call to action said, join us, spread the word, yeah, we need to act today. I like what Yanir said, which is it's never too late. We can help end this together, but we have to start now. And I know Jan I don't know if he's available to speak up or say
Oh, I
anything to
can.
the group.
I would have. Yeah, I would have him on mute. But Jan, if you want to say something, I'm just gonna let you do that in a second.
Jan Lotwals from Zero COVID Sweden.
Okay. One sec.
So you're welcome to talk, Jan, if it's possible. I know it's really late right now in Sweden, so don't hesitate if
You can unmute yourself now, Jan, if you have something you want to say.
He's muted.
Camera's on. You just got to hit your microphone button.
More time.
One more.
One more time.
Yeah,
One more
there you go.
time. There we go. Fourth time it works. So I think it's wonderful what you guys are doing. Everyone is doing. Yanir is pushing for to achieve a stop of spreading of the disease. Vaccination is going to take us a big step forward, right? In reducing the spread of the virus. But just as Yanir said, the new variants are scary and risky. We might have other waves, or what others could call even other pandemics, new pandemics with other very much mutated variants of the SARS-CoV-2. So trying to push for this joint zero COVID effort internationally, following in the footsteps of New Zealand, China, Taiwan, and many other countries, I think is a great effort. And we'll try to put something up on the internet by next week, as you guys are doing as well. So thanks for inviting me, and thanks for doing this.
it's a joint effort. In fact, what we're
is.
seeing in Canada is just an excerpt of what we see in so many countries, but those who are taking the good decisions so far. So I think thanks for these words. Thank you very much, Yanir, for what you have explained us, your insightful comments and remarks. Thank you, Connor, Dosia, and Maria for all your presentation, great presentation. And I want to thank all the people which are listening to this and that will take action in the coming days. As Maria just said, the time is now. Time is of the essence here, and the sooner is the better. So waiting is just losing the battle. Thanks very much to all of you, and happy Easter weekend. It's this Good Friday, and see you soon.
And good night from Sweden.
No.